Welcome to Friday night's video in our second master series. This is the 21st video in our second master series, and it is the third video looking at spectrometers. So basically, what we want to talk about in this video is footprints. So this is a real basic concept that if you look back and you remember Master Series 2, number 8, when we mapped out harmonics, we want to map out footprints of sounds. Now, sounds will be periodic, like a patch on a synth that doesn't have any frequency and volume modulation going on, and to semi-periodic where it'll be fluctuating, to quasi-periodic where it'll be changing quite a bit. But most of the time there is a cycle that repeats that you want to map out. So basically we talked about, in Master Series 2, number 9, getting some good audio to map things out and to analyze audio to be able to analyze well. Looping an area or having a test capture, like this is, we're looking at this vocal that I captured that went, ah. Now I've processed this perfect to where the track, this is a test capture going ah, but the actual song of the guy, and then we all went down to Georgia, it sounds perfect. It's ready for the mix. It's beautiful. And I processed the test capture the same way I did that after practicing. So it's just beautiful. Now I have a file to make footprints of. You can do this with vocals, guitar notes, bass notes, piano notes, chords, drum hits, just about any sound you want. Drum hits are kind of hard. Cymbals, things like that are kind of hard. They're percussive. But I do suggest you map them out anyway. They're a little more difficult because of they're percussive and not musical, and it makes it a little bit difficult, like we talked about when we were mapping out sounds on number 8, mapping out harmonics. But you can still map them out so you have a reference. So when you're going along looking at your oscilloscope and you're looking at your spectrometer, that you have references to map out and go, what's different? Why does it just sound different? And also you have references to go back to and know that vocal or that bass note or that snare drum was perfect. And I have a perfect map of it on my for the spectrogram, like we did in number 8, and I've got a perfect oscilloscope map of it like we're doing now, so that I've got it mapped out real well. You have to understand that they might not be exact replicas, but they should be close enough, just like we did in number 8, to where they give you a really good idea if something's out of whack. Or when you start low pass filtering, high pass filtering, notch filtering, or you're enhancing with EQ, or you're sound sculpting, or whatever you might be doing, that you have a reference to go, does that look closer to that did? Because that, when I did that country song and that guy's voice was perfect. Now, now does it look like that? Or it doesn't sound quite the same? Well, am I getting close? And you have a reference, it can help you immensely. And that concept is mapping this out. We have a footprint that goes, it's starting the cycle, starting here, it goes up 1 hump, 2 humps, 3 humps, little dip, and then back to here. And then you can see this cycle repeating. It's going to repeat that. You see that little hump there, and that little hump there, and that little hump there, and that little hump there. So that cycle is repeating from this 1 hump, 2 humps, 3 humps, little dip, and then repeat. Now, this is a semi-periodic or quasi-periodic waveform because it's a vocal. It means there's going to be volume and frequency modulations happening, which is different than a lot of sounds. Guitar, bass, piano, things like that, there might be some, but there's vocals and things like that are much more difficult because there's much more things like that going on. And, complex synth patches. Be careful about trying to map synth patches for the rest of your life because you will eventually not want to. You map basic synth patches that are starting points for you, and then things that you were doing to it that you might have done. Now you have a footprint just in case not getting where you want, so you have something to reference. But if you look at this go all the way across this test capture, it remains pretty constant. It's either quasi-periodic or semi-periodic, somewhere in between that. And like I recommended, you go back and watch the videos that I have on sound, complex waveforms, waveforms in general, and to get a little bit better understanding of some of the things I'm talking about here so that you can relate a little bit better. But anyway, this waveform in this cycle is fairly much repeating. I get towards back in here, and I'm seeing that this little nip that's going down is starting to get a little jagged. because it's changing a little bit as the quasi-periodic waveform goes through time. Here it's flattened out a little bit because it's just a vocal icon, you know, a test capture going ah, but I've processed it perfect. So now I've got a good map. Now I can do a couple different things. I can get snapshots of this on this waveform, or I can go into my oscilloscope, whatever sound this is, and get a one shot or something like we talked about in the last video. And then what do I have? I've got this footprint. So basically I've got this footprint that's going from here. Here's where that's starting. From here, we know it's going up, 1 hump, 2 humps, 3 humps, and then a little dip. So I basically have this waveform that is basically this right here. And so we have this as a footprint to take a look at when we're looking at our oscilloscope, whenever we're doing the same type of processing on the same instrument, or a vocal, a male vocal, a female vocal, you know, a country vocalist, a rock vocalist, you know, a keyboard, a chord, a guitar chord with that type of sound, with that type of processing that came out perfect, you know, for this country song. So if you really do a lot, used to doing reggae, or you're really used to doing da 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 da, and this other band comes in, or you're redoing it, and their stuff does not, the last band came in, it sounded good to begin with, then I fixed him up and it was beautiful. This guy has not got his stuff together that well, and I have to fix his sound, and it sounds as good as the other guy without trying to tell him that, you know, he doesn't know how to use his amplifier and then get fired. You know what I'm saying? So I know that sounds funny, but you've got this reference. So now you've taken a snapshot of that, basically like with your camera or something, and you can go in there and map this out. So now you have this map. You have this footprint of what that sound sounds like that you've just mastered perfectly. It's ready to go in the mix. It just sounds awesome. And you got this footprint. It's about 6.9 milliseconds in length, the actual cycle. And you can see the distances from the start to this peak is 0.57 milliseconds. To this point where it hits zero crossing is 0.6 milliseconds from here. And then so on and so forth. To the next point is that 0.45 milliseconds, to the next point is so many milliseconds, so on and so forth throughout the cycle of the waveform, so that you have some reference of distance and time. And you can also do this with samples. How many samples? I would suggest I didn't on this one, but you can also do it with samples, how many samples it is across, and their levels, their peaks. Now here, this is the peak at that peak where it drops, at that peak where it rises, at that peak, at that peak, at that peak. Now, the only other thing that's really inherent in this is slopes and things like that. The amount that, the degree of the slope, which is very hard to map when you're dealing with audio unless you get a really good oscilloscope. So we're not going to get that too much, but we talked about that in sound sculpting. I suggest you watch those videos. And rounding off this up here or flattening it off is going to start adding like odd harmonics, where straightening it up to slope is adding odd harmonics. Also, fattening it out is going to add like even harmonics. Like here, you get a bunch of even harmonic content over a very small amount of time. This from 0.73 milliseconds, it is only 0.6 milliseconds from here to here. And it's actually adding harmonic content, changing the harmonic content in that small amount of time as it would on this one. I know it sounds ridiculous. You're thinking, my God, bro, this is ridiculous. I'm not trying to build a rocket ship. Well, you might not be trying to build a rocket ship with your production, but when you're doing this vocal and you got the test captor and you've looped some area of them and you're sculpting it and it sounds perfect and you want it to sound as good as that one you just spent so much time on, where it was just, yeah, dude, Beyonce would drool over that. And you're going, you got some kind of a footprint to go by and go, well, this is what this one came out sounding like, and this is what the footprint looked here. And then if you look at the harmonic footprint that we made with the spectrogram in Master Series 2, number 8, you've got a couple good footprints with your spectrogram and your oscilloscope out in a couple different monitors or whatever, and you can reference this to really see what you're looking for when you're high pass, low pass filtering, and looking at these references and looking at your oscilloscope as time goes by, that you'll get used to seeing footprints, certain types of footprints happening, knowing when things are being periodic, semi-periodic, or quasi-periodic, to where they're changing a lot, but still repeating some type of repetitiveness and cycles. that you will get much better at visualizing issues and seeing things. And not only that, but you will see issues that might be happening in there. You might see little glitches or other things that are going on that are a problem. They're not this footprint that you have that you know sounds perfect. And so there's something else going on. It's some hiss in the high end, or it's some rumble in the low end, or it's some frequency out of whack, that's causing, some difference here. Or you might have who knows what's going on. All the things that we talk about, the things we talked about in the first Master Series about making sound as good as possible, all those things that you do will affect the footprint and cause it to look a little differently. And when you get one that's perfect, that's great, you want to map it out. Just like we talked about in number 8 for harmonics. Then you have this oscilloscope. You've got this mapped out to where you've got this beautiful footprint of that vocalist. So this is like a country vocalist going, and then like that. And it was just beautiful, bro. It just came out so, oh yeah. And when he was singing, doing his parts, whether low parts or high parts or a country singer or a rock singer or whatever's going on, that you know what kind of a footprint you're looking at. So your oscilloscope means something to you, which is going to take time you mapping these things out, just like it did when we talked about in number 8, that this is going to take time, but you know what you're looking for. That way you can get in there with your oscilloscope and you can start mapping this out. It's starting out here and you're going, okay, the difference, you see it just went to difference. So the difference from there to there is so many milliseconds or samples, from there to there, 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 through the cycle. And also you're looking at different levels. You can look at percentages or levels also, and the amount of samples between it, and get it really mapped out well. One big thing that I want to you have to consider is when you're doing this, make sure you've got your peaks close to 0 dB as possible without clipping. That way when you start making your maps, that these readings aren't like, well, this is on this one, it's down at minus 4 dB, but it's not going up to almost 0 dB. So if I'm trying to match it against something else and get a footprint, I'm not getting good readings, and I'm never going to be able to read it well. That way that, all these cycles are going through and it's as close to dB as possible, the max peak transients that are happening in the cycles, that way that you can relate them well when you're looking at other footprints of other stuff. But this is immeasurably valuable, because then when you're going through and looking at any type of sound, whether it's a drum hit or whether it's a bass note or whether it's anything, it's got a footprint. Just like if you look at a sinusoid here, or a square wave, or a triangle wave, or a sawtooth wave, that you can look at them on an oscilloscope, and then you can look at their harmonic content that we've talked about, what's normally inherent in those type of waves as periodic waveforms. What kind of content they normally have in them, which is the same with any waveform. You're going to have that relate directly. The footprint in the oscilloscope and the footprint on the spectrogram are going to relate that same type of information. So making up a library of these is going to help you immensely. That way when you're looking at things, that you're not looking at jiggly, giggly, blue, gloggly nutcase and just nothing, that a lot of people just throw their oscilloscope in the garbage because they haven't spent the time to understand this. And most of the things that we're talking about here are not rocket science. We're not talking about rocket science here. This is not really that difficult. We're talking about distance and time, and or samples, or both, and we're talking about levels on peaks. And then we're looking at things like slope differences, rounding or flattening, or bulging out, or rising up sharply, or more of an angle, and whether they're rounding or whether they're sharp, whether this is rounded or it's jagged or it's peaking real sharp or it's flattening out. All these things are inherent in the sound. And as you get used to using that, once you start mapping these out, that also you go in there and start messing with them when you're processing and see what it's doing to it. So you'll see how it's affecting the footprint itself, so you can see the difference between a bad footprint and a good footprint that you've processed to where it came out sounding awesome. And it's a growing thing for you to become that quote-unquote virtuoso master audio engineer. So this is one of those things you need to go through to get to that level. This is just a picture I took with my camera off my oscilloscope, and then in my Mac I started fussing around and making notes on it, and with different colors and It's not that difficult to do. So that is basically the next step in understanding the oscilloscope. You want to get some footprints of the main sounds that you're normally using most of the time that have been processed well. So peace, hope, love. I'll see you in the next video.